Good morning. My name is Judith Silty, and I'm in the NIC History Department, and I would like to welcome you all to our Popcorn Forum Convocations program for the week. I don't know about you, but I have always been fascinated with the idea of time travel. I'm sure that's how I ended up a historian. As I walk around campus from class to class, I often like to try and imagine what it looked like when this area was an encampment for the Coeur d'Alene peoples. Or as I look out over Rathdrum Prairie from a place like Carnegie's and look at the houses and businesses and trailers spreading out across the prairie, I like to imagine it when the Indian horses ran free there, or perhaps thousands of years ago when the world's greatest flood broke through the ice dam and swept through our area and changed it forever. This week we have an opportunity to do time travel all week long. And I think it should be a fascinating experience. Those of you who are here at 9 this morning and heard Thomas Jefferson, I think got a taste of how interesting it can be. As with this morning's presentation, we'll be doing this hour a three-part session. The first section, we will have a distinguished guest whom I'll introduce in a moment, giving you a general statement. Then he will be open for questions from the audience, and we had some great ones in the first session. I'm sure you will be thinking of some yourself now. And finally, in the last moment, he will step out of character and answer questions as himself. Himself, that is our time capsule pilot for this morning's session, is Frederick Krebs, a professor of history at Johnson County Community College in Kansas. He has been a professor of Western and Eastern civilization for some years. He's been recognized as a distinguished faculty member there at Johnson County. For 17 years, he's been involved in doing various kinds of historical reenactments, and he tells me that this morning's person is not the only one he does, and he enjoys them all greatly. This morning's person is Galileo Galilei, whose name probably scarcely needs an introduction. I won't say a great deal about Galileo himself, but to help you climb into the time capsule and travel back to the 1500s, let me give you just a little bit of context for the journey that we're about to begin together. It is 1564, the year of Galileo's birth to a poor but distinguished court musician's family in Pisa, Italy. Europe in general, and Italy in particular, are still in the midst of that amazing age of vitality and discovery known as the Renaissance. Italy, and especially nearby Florence, has been its center for more than a century. The great artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci, now dead, lived not far away, and Michelangelo, the most towering figure of the age, is in the last year of his life, just as Galileo is born. In this same year of 1564, in faraway England, where Elizabeth I is reigning as queen, the Shakespeare family of Stratford-on-Avon has just celebrated the birth of a son, William. And depending on their religious convictions, the Swiss and the French are either mourning or celebrating the death this year of John Calvin, the controversial pioneer of the Protestant Reformation. It has been just 72 years since the Italian Columbus, whose home in Genoa was not far away, rediscovered America, and 72 years since the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the last surviving Muslims and Jews from Christian Spain. It has been 44 years since Hernan Cortez and others, driven by a mixture of greed and Christian enthusiasm, conquered Mexico and devastated the rich cultures of Mesoamerica. Perhaps more than ever before, the Catholic Church is now the hub of European life, not only spiritually, but intellectually, artistically, and politically. But major challenges to church authority and teachings have begun to come increasingly insistently from many directions, not only from Martin Luther and John Calvin and countless others who call for radical reform of the church, or even from monarchs like the Tudors, Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth, who steer a political course that defies the church authority, but also from the exciting new world of science. It has been just 21 years since the death of the Polish astronomer Nikolai Copernicus, who generated enormous controversy by suggesting that the sun, not the Earth, is the center of the solar system. To address all challenges to its spiritual and intellectual authority, the Catholic Church continues to rely on the Inquisition, a system designed to root out heresy or unacceptable belief. During the next 78 years, Galileo's lifetime, enormous changes will sweep the world. The Spanish Armada will fail in its attempt to invade England. Spanish Mexico will flourish, becoming the richest, most civilized nation in the Americas, with the hemisphere's first university. The English will establish colonies in North America, first in Virginia in 1607 and then in Massachusetts in 1620, and the French will found Quebec in 1608. The controversial Italian monk Giordano Bruno will be burned at the stake for spreading Copernicus' ideas, which are contrary to church teaching. The German astronomer Johannes Kepler, just 6 years younger than Galileo, will publish radical new theories about the elliptical orbits of the planets. The Dutch invention of the spyglass will excite scientists everywhere and inspire Galileo to improve on it. The King James Bible will be published, giving the common folk of England and its colonies direct access to the scriptures and encouraging them to think for themselves. Universities across Europe will explore the new thinking with increasing independence, with Italy, Holland, France, and England the greatest centers of discovery. Even in faraway Massachusetts, on the edge of the wilderness, Harvard College will be founded for the same purpose. And throughout Galileo's life, religious wars between Catholicism and Protestantism will devastate France, Holland, England, and Germany, killing multitudes and breeding even greater intolerance of every kind. When Galileo dies in 1642, the latest of these wars of religion will erupt in England, tearing it apart and costing its king his head. And in that same year in England will be born a boy destined to further change our worldview forever. His name is Isaac Newton. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Galileo Galilei.
Buongiorno. It is a pleasure to be here. I have heard little of this land in my time, but I am pleased to be here. I have many problems of my own. In my time, around 1633, I am now somewhat concerned. In July of 1632, after much delay and the death of Prince Federico Sesi, who was to publish my work, the work that I have spent much of my life on was finally published. The Dialogue of the Chief World Systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican. I thought that this publication had been done under license with the blessing of His Holiness Pope Urban VIII. And yet scarcely a month after the publication began, and there were many, many copies being sold, the Holy Office ordered publication to cease, and in October I was placed under arrest and ordered to come to Rome to defend myself before the office of the Holy Inquisition. I was unable to do so. My patron, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand II de' Medici, and physicians wrote letters protesting that to move me would result in my death. We were granted a short delay, but His Holy Father would not be denied. And in February of 1633, I was brought to Rome and placed in prison. In the last month, I have been told of the gravity of my offense, that I have defied an order of 1616 that I was not to teach the works of Copernicus, and I have been told that I have been on the very verge, the very edge of heresy. I have been told the possibility that purification by fire may be the only way to atone for my sins. I do not take this too seriously. I am 70 years old, almost 70. I do not suspect they will do that. But they have shown me, through the practice of territio realizatio, the realization of terror, the instruments of torture. I do not expect they will torture me, because I have decided to abjure my beliefs, to recant what they say that I have said. And I have been told that for doing this, I will be given leniency. I expect a relatively light sentence, and then I will be allowed to join my daughter at the convent where she is a nun, and perhaps these great plagues of my life, this hernia, which is growing larger and which has caused me great pain, my growing difficulties with the pains in my joints, and the very fact that I feel near death, I will at last be allowed to die in peace. My public life is over, and my hopes of feeling that I have any place among the living have vanished. In fact, I feel that I am in a body alive, but for all other purposes, I am absent from the living. And yet, I do not quite understand how it has come to this. For indeed, I have asked the Office of the Inquisition to remove 2 parts of the charges against me, and they have consented to do that. One part is that I have not been an Orthodox Catholic, and the second part is that I have been willfully disobedient to the Holy Father. I never entered into my studies with the thought that I should, first of all, prove that Copernicus was correct, or second of all, seek to challenge the holy word of the Bible. Indeed, though I had a reputation in my days at the University of Pisa as being difficult with my professors and constantly questioning them, it was because I wondered about an attempt to observe nature which from the very beginning imposed certain assumptions upon the way we were to observe. Very early in my life, I began to utter those words that we can observe nature only through the experience of the senses and through the necessary observation of mathematics. And those who followed Aristotle, the peripatetics as we call them, seemed to me that they are more concerned about describing the quality of words and the very substance of words than they are in trying to understand the evidence of the senses or the facts as they have been presented. Now, my disgust, my discouragement with those who would call themselves philosophers perhaps is inherited to some degree. My father, Vincenzio, a court musician, found himself in constant conflict with those who would talk about the theory of music as prescribed by Aristotle and others of the ancients. And in fact, he published a dialogue on ancient and modern music, in which he argued that we must constantly examine our theories by applying them to their performance in practice. This was sneered at by those who consider themselves philosophers, because as philosophers, they were not interested in what they called techne, the things of the practical. They were only interested in what they called episteme, the things of theory, of knowledge. And yet, in some ways, I am a simple man. I have written most of my work not in the Latin, but in the Tuscan dialect. I enjoy the literature of such authors as Rosato and others because I enjoy the way they tell the common sense, and I might say somewhat bawdy tales of the countryside. I have been a man who has enjoyed crafting instruments with my hands and attempting to devise means by which we could test propositions. I had a brief teaching career at the University of Pisa, where I was born, but I spent some of my boyhood in Florence, not far from Pisa. But I offended some of my professors by my constant studies of mathematics and by my questioning of the ideas about the center of gravity of solid objects as proposed by Aristotle. I much more preferred the ideas of Archimedes. But I was very fortunate that after many years of being vacant, a position in mathematics was filled at the University of Padua, near Venice. And perhaps fortunate, too, because Venice was a place that had less, shall we say, allegiance to the authority of the Pope. Perhaps no place in Italy, perhaps in all of Europe, was there more freedom of thought and opinion. Freedom to pursue the truth by the criteria of the experience of the senses and the necessary demonstration of mathematics. I think my time in Padua were the happiest times of my life. I never married, you know. But at Padua, I met Marina Gamba. And we were together for 12 years, and we had 3 children, 2 daughters, and my son, Vincencio. Both of my daughters have taken orders in a convent now near Florence. I enjoyed the circle of intellectuals both around the University of Padua, but even more among some of the wealthy merchants and townsmen in Padua and even in Venice. I not only taught mathematics, but I spent some time with the young noblemen who were more interested in issues of military careers. And so I privately taught them ideas of military strategy and the use of artillery and the ideas on fortifications. I even invented at that time what some people would call a sector, a military compass, a geometrical and military compass, a calculating tool that not only was useful in artillery, but in all manners of calculation. I crafted this myself and then hired a workman to make more of them, and I wrote a book explaining how to use the instrument, and I also taught classes for a fee in which I explained how to use this instrument. But it was here at Padua that I began much of my investigation of some of the thoughts of Aristotle, particularly as applied to motion. Aristotle had suggested that objects of the same substance, even though they were of varying weights, if they were dropped, the heavier object would fall much faster than the lighter object. Well, now, you perhaps have heard that in Pisa I went up on the tower and attempted to test this, but that was perhaps a story invented by an enthusiastic pupil. I did not test objects in that way, but I did drop objects, usually trying to test the idea of Aristotle, that he said that if you had an object of what you might call 100 pounds and an object of 1 pound, that if you would drop them from 100 cubits, the object of what you would call 100 pounds would land before the other object of 1 pound had traveled 1 cubit. The heavier object of 100 pounds would have traveled 100 cubits. Well, I did not find this to be the case. I found that objects of different weights but of similar substance, when dropped from the same height, arrived almost exactly at the same time in their impact on the earth. Well, there was a man on our faculty at Padua by the name of Crenomini who was a great defender of Aristotle. So he tried my experiment, and he wrote back to say to me that my criticisms of Aristotle were faulty, because he had tried the experiment and had found that the lighter object actually arrived 2 seconds later than the heavier object. And I said to him, so you are going to tell me that Aristotle stands because in dropping these balls, one of 1 pound, one of 100 pounds, instead of one only traveling 1/100th the distance, while the heavier object impacted the earth, it arrived a mere 2 seconds later. That means that Aristotle stands unchallenged, and I am absolutely wrong. This is the problem with the Peripatetics, these followers of Aristotle. They are so concerned about the truth of the Word that they do not look at the evidence of the senses or the demonstrations of mathematics. And what I have been doing in my life is I have found that mathematics can be used to make careful measurements. And in this precise use of mathematics, as applied as I did to the concept of the pendulum and to other problems of motions, I have found that mathematics now becomes a useful tool. A tool that the philosophers, I might say, regard as beneath them because it is of the practical, of techne, and is not of the higher cosmological questions they wish to explore. It seems that I am constantly, however, being brought into some confrontation with the ideas of Copernicus, although I must tell you that we have little in the way of mathematical measurements to support the ideas of Copernicus. It seems to me that reason would suggest that the sun is indeed at the center of our solar system. But little had been presented in the way of mathematical evidence or of sense experience that would support this. But there was a comet that was observed, a supernova, some would call it, around 1605. And the question was, did this exist between the Earth and the moon, or was it beyond the moon in what was called the celestial sphere? This was an important question, because everything from the moon further in these 10 circular spheres proposed by Ptolemy, according to Aristotle's theories, had to be perfect, without flaw, without blemish. There could be no change. So if these comets were between the Earth and the moon, that was acceptable. But if they were beyond the Earth and the moon, this would lay some doubt as to the ideas of Aristotle and would therefore be unacceptable. Well, I suggested, as Johannes Kepler suggested, that this comet was beyond the moon. But again, I had very little evidence to support this. And then, as I came to Florence to become the court philosopher and court mathematician for Lorenzo Medici and later for Cosimo II Medici, I had occasion to learn of a wonderful instrument, a spyglass, and I determined to make my own. And I found that by grinding my lenses and placing the convex and the concave lenses in the proper proportion to each other, that I was able to eventually construct a spyglass that enabled me to see 1,000 times further than I had been able to see with the naked eye, and to make objects 60 times larger than they had appeared to the naked eye. And with this, in the early winter, in January, December and January of 1609 and 1610, I began to use my spyglass, which about 18 months later would be called the telescope. I began to use it to observe the moon. And the first thing that I observed of the moon was that its surface was not smooth and crystalline and perfect as Aristotle had said. But I found mountains on the moon, and great blemishes and craters, and illuminated spots and dark spots, which I thought might be very well what one might see of land, which would be illuminated, and water, which would be dark, if one were to be able to rise above the earth and look at it, perhaps from the moon. And so I thought that perhaps these dark areas might be seas on the moon. Well, these findings alone caused great alarm among the philosophers, because I was suggesting that the moon was not perfect and unblemished. But I detected something else. I detected that it seemed to me that as I looked at the moon, I observed shadows of the earth on the moon, and these shadows moved from one night to another. And this alarmed the philosophers even more, because the earth did not move. And then, on the night of January the 9th, 1610, using my spyglass, I looked out toward Jupiter, and I discovered a new planet. Then two, then three. And on January the 13th, 4 of them. I named them the Medicean stars in honor of my patron. And I observed something else about these new planets, that each night they were in different positions. On the night of January 13th, one of the Medicean stars was westerly of Jupiter, and 3 were lined up easterly of Jupiter. But sometimes I would find 2 to the east and 1 to the west, and not see the other one. Sometimes I would find other combinations. And what this suggested was that these stars moved, and they moved around Jupiter. And then, when I put my telescope and I observed that Venus itself has phases like our moon, the concept that Venus too was in motion not around the earth but around the sun led me to feel that we had a great deal of evidence now to suggest that the sun was stationary or at the center, and that the earth and the other planets were moving around the sun, as had been suggested by Copernicus. I had also just recently read the work of Johannes Kepler, in which he suggested that these were not circular orbits, but an ellipse. And his work particularly helped support an earlier work of mine of about 5 years earlier about the tides, in which I suggested that the tides could be explained only if one accepted the two circular motions suggested by Copernicus if the Earth was moving around the sun. Well, I must say there was a great deal of controversy that began. But I have never shied away from controversy. Ever since that villain, Baldassar Capra, stole my idea of the military compass and attempted to claim it as his own, and I wrote a polemic against him, I have found that I enjoy writing polemics in defense against my critics. And so things became very busy starting in 1611. Things became extremely controversial. I had a young pupil who had taken my place at the mathematics chair at the University of Padua, and young Castelli was even more adamant than I, to the point that by 1613, both the Jesuits and the Dominicans in Rome were saying we must do something about these disturbing ideas of, and they called us the Galileists, as if we were some faction or party. The mother of our Grand Duke, Cosmo, the Grand Duchess Christina, began to question my pupil Castelli, and finally I wrote her a letter in 1615 in which I attempted to explain that my discoveries should be of no concern to the church. Now, I would have to confess that I had not made things any easier on myself, because one of the polemics I had engaged in 1613 was a series of letters to a member of the church, a priest in the church by the name of Lorini, over the issue of sunspots, which had been observed on the sun, and which he insisted were actually not on the surface of the sun, but simply minor planets or minor objects that were between the earth and the sun, thereby not violating the theories of Aristotle. But my observation of the sunspots indicated that they were in motion, and they further supported the idea that the sun was at the center and other bodies were in motion around the sun, and that the sunspots actually moved on the surface of the sun. This had seemed that I was challenging all of the biblical ideas, particularly the concept that the sun had stood still, the concept that man and the earth were at the center of God's creation. And so in my letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, I said to her what I have maintained all of my life, and that is that I am a man of faith. I am greatly concerned about the salvation of my soul. But I quoted in that letter from St. Augustine, perhaps the greatest of the church fathers, in which I pointed out his statement that those of faith should not bother themselves with the controversies and issues of the world. He said, what to him does it matter if the sun is a sphere or the moon is circular or not? These do not affect the quest for salvation of the soul, and these arguments take time away from the devotions of the faithful. I went even further to say that God is the creator of both the Holy Word and of nature, and that we know the Holy Word through faith, And we know the Holy Word through the Holy Ghost. But in nature we also see the hand of God. And nature is the observant executrix of God's will. And God has given us the gift of reason that through nature we might better see Him. And it was through that divine illumination that I was able to develop my telescope. I see no conflict between my studies of science, or even the ideas of Copernicus, and those of faith, because our studies have nothing to do with the salvation of the soul, and that is what the Holy Word of the Bible and the church is about. I do not ask the church to support the ideas of Copernicus. I simply ask the church to not involve itself in this controversy. It is of no concern to the church if Ptolemy is correct or Copernicus is correct. They do not affect the matters of faith. Well, Pope Paul V was not particularly interested in the arguments of intellectuals. And I was called before the Holy Office, and after some examination in 1616, my friend, but also a member of the very court that had condemned Bruno to the stake, the Cardinal Bellarmine, came to me and said that I had been told that I must not defend or uphold the ideas of Copernicus, but I could continue on with my studies and my writings. Now, there are some who maintain that the written papal order also said, nor teach the ideas of Copernicus. But no such written order was given to me. I maintained a copy of what Cardinal Bellarmine gave to me. And 3 years later, when more comments came, and I wrote through a pupil letters disputing the conclusions of one of the Jesuits about the motion of these comets, suggesting that indeed they were in the celestial area where Aristotle said there could be no comets, I found myself under some attack. But in 1623, my good friend, Cardinal Manfredo Barberini, became Pope Urban VIII. And I dedicated my work, my new work, The Assayer, to him. At the same time, I had begun work at writing the two dialogues. I talked at some length with His Holiness about my new book. I thought that I had his blessing. When it came time to publish the book, we were given a license by the church to publish this book as not being in conflict with the ideas of the church. And then someone showed a document that had never been an official document to His Holiness, and he became angered that this document said I was not to even teach the ideas of Copernicus. Even if I was not upholding or defending them, I was not even to present them as a hypothesis. And this brought me then to my present condition. Well, from this condition, I will tell you that sentence will be handed down, and in that sentence, I will be condemned to life imprisonment, denied to do any writing without the strict supervision of the church, and under penalty of torture and the stake should I do so. In spite of the fact that I did abjure myself from my statements and admit and confess to perhaps too much vanity in my enthusiasm for the ideas of Copernicus. Fortunately, the Archbishop, Cardinal Piccinillo, has taken me into his home. He has restored both my health and my sanity. I am heartened that visitors such as Thomas Hobbes and John Milton from England tell me that the two dialogues have been published in English and even in some Latin in England. I am at work on a new book. But now, as 1638 approaches, my beloved daughter, Virginia, Sister Maria Celeste, has passed away. My health is not good. I have begun to lose sight in both eyes, but I have completed my book, The New Sciences, in which I talk about two sciences of mathematics on the strength of materials and on natural motion. I have solved the great problem on motion as to the relationship of acceleration to motion. And now I would like to be allowed to return to Florence. At this point, this has been forbidden by His Holiness. But I am hopeful that he will allow an old man of nearly 75 to spend his last years at peace. I, in my life, have not sought to deny faith or the Holy Word. But there is a truth to be found in the mathematics of the great bodies of the universe, in the mathematics of the motion of objects on the surface of the earth, in the movement of the tides. We must not be slaves to those thoughts based simply upon the assumptions or the unexamined authority of anyone. We must seek freedom of thought, and in doing so, make careful measurements with mathematics and examine the observation of our senses to find those laws of physical objects that govern our planet, and I believe that govern even the other planets and the far stars in the Milky Way. And this is not a challenge to God or to faith. This is the fulfillment of the illumination given to us through reason by God. Thank you. I would be pleased to answer some questions. I believe I'm going to have some assistance on fielding the questions. So I think we're getting that set up right now. Your technology is a little strange to me, but it is wondrous. I think we have a question right in the front here. Well, let's do one.
Okay, I'll do this one. What made you think the sun was in the middle of the solar system?
All right, I think that's a very good question. The question is, what made me think the sun was in the middle of the solar system? Well, first of all, I want to say that all conclusions that I reach, I regard as only temporary or tentative, based on the idea that new observations may cause me to revise my conclusions. But the evidence that I had seen in January of 1610 with the spyglass, later called a telescope, seemed to suggest that the Earth was in motion. The phases of Venus, the fact that Venus, like our moon, had different phases, crescents, you might say, suggested that Venus was in motion not in relation to the Earth, but in relation to the sun. And the moons, as they later were called, of Jupiter, the Medicean stars, by the fact that they rotated around Jupiter, also suggested rotation around the sun. But even Tycho Brahe had said that that was possible. It did not mean that everything was then not eventually rotating around the earth. But the fact that I actually saw changing shadows of the earth on the moon and changing shapes of Venus from the earth indicated to me that the earth was also in motion. And that convinced me that the earth, too, was in rotation around the sun. We may come back to some of your other questions, but I want to give everyone a chance who would like to ask a question. I think we have one back this way.
You spoke briefly about your patronage. What events in your life led up to your patronage, and more generally, how did one in your time become physically your patronage?
Can you repeat that for me?
Yes, about your patronage. You spoke about your patronage briefly. During your life, what events led to your patronage, and in general, how did one in your time become visible to a patron?
Well, my patrons were the Medici family. I had first, I think, come to their attention because of my father, Vincenzo, who had had dealings with the Medici court when I was growing up in Florence. But I would also say that I had spent a summer in 1605 as a tutor to the heir to the Medici duchy, and that would have been Cosimo, later Cosimo II, the Grand Duke. I had at that time suggested that I would be interested in some employment by them, but I think it was my work with the telescope that finally led to my being granted the position of court philosopher and court mathematician. And this was partly because of the fact that the University of Padua was quite willing to give me a lifetime appointment at double my salary. But I would never again get an increase in salary, and all of my royalties, you might say, benefits from the telescope would belong to the government of Venice. And so I was quite eager for other positions, and at this time the Medici family was quite willing to do this. As to seeking a patron, all who were not of the nobility needed the support of a patron. And it was by demonstrating one's talents or abilities that one might be approached and offered some type of position with a patron. Perhaps another question.
Mr. Galileo, you did a marvelous job in using the empirical method to support your cosmological theories. Why were you not tempted to apply empiricism to the notion of soul and God that you so happily caved into without demanding evidence for those concepts too?
Well, I think the reason why I did not feel that the methods of science were appropriate to matters of faith was that I regarded the concept of the salvation of the soul as the main concern of the church, and I accepted the division made by St. Augustine that matters of faith were not issues of science. But on the same token, matters of science were not issues of faith. And I merely asked the church not to take a position on the correctness or incorrectness of those issues of science which were not within the realm of salvation of the soul. I was quite content to follow the ideas of both Augustine and Aquinas, that the issues of revealed theology were not matters of science. But I wish to be free to pursue matters of science without having imposed on it the issues of faith.
I was wondering if you would comment on why the church was so enamored with the philosophy of Aristotle and why that held so much sway over their thinking, particularly with regard to its implications for faith, which you were suggesting are basically irrelevant to that issue.
Why was the church so enamored with the ideas of Aristotle? I do not know. I never could understand how the ideas of the philosophers, which were so patently not based on reason and not illogical, not logical, but simply based upon assumptions and assertions of authority, how the church could accept that. And yet, late in my life, I wrote a letter to a friend in which I said that I was actually a better Aristotelian, peripatetic, than they were. Because the first great issue of Aristotle is that you should not examine things except through the careful use of reason. And I felt I was more skilled at reason than the peripatetics. And so on that basis, I was a better peripatetic than they were. And secondly, Aristotle suggested we should support our conclusions through experience and through evidence of the senses. And no one has been more true to that than I. And so I think that it is the erroneous pursuit of the ideas of Aristotle, this turning of Aristotle into some kind of a tyrant and a despot whose very words cannot be examined or questioned, and whose words are held true even though measurement suggests errors, perhaps in application of his theories. This great mystery as to how the church felt that it was threatened by supporting an erroneous system has mystified me. I could not understand why anyone could take offense at what I did. We have questions.
Galileo?
Yes.
Is it true that your real problem at the Holy Office was not that you held Copernicus' view of the universe, but that you proclaimed to have demonstrated it? And in reality, did you demonstrate it?
I'm not hearing that last part.
Had you truly demonstrated Copernicus' view, the heliocentric view of the universe, or were your demonstrations not true?
Oh. Well, I first of all would suggest that I would not consider myself as one who is, I think the word would be a zealot on the issue of Copernicus. But I would also suggest that my current hypotheses lead me to believe that Copernicus is more true than Ptolemy. And I believe that the evidence that I have seen, not simply in the matters of what I've observed on the moon or with the stars or with Jupiter, but also what I've observed in terms of motion and of tides, lead me to think that the concepts of Copernicus are more accurate than the concepts of Ptolemy. But I hesitate to proclaim any final truth when there is still much left to demonstrate. Does that address your question? I have been in controversy with the church from about 1611 because of the things I published in the what you would call the Starry Messenger. I came into further criticism with the church, particularly among some Jesuits, in 1613 with my letters about sunspots. This finally then came to an investigation in late 1615 and 1616. But there had been, I would say, constant conflict and attacks on me by the philosophers since the publications in the Starry Messenger. Well, I think that might be the version that some would insist. But I would tell you that I was told that I must no longer uphold or defend. I was not prohibited to teach as a hypothesis the ideas of Copernicus. And in fact, in 1620, the church itself made some minor revisions to the ideas of Copernicus and allowed those ideas to be reprinted and published again. So I was simply told that I could not any longer uphold or defend through these observations that I had made that Copernicus was absolutely true. And in fact, I abjured my ideas again in 1633 that Copernicus must be taken as absolutely true, and suggested then that I had never proclaimed him to be absolutely true. Perhaps another question.
Can you refresh my memory, please? Copernicus lived in...
Copernicus spent much of his life in the area known as the Holy Roman Empire, in the region that you might call Poland today.
Poland today. Thank you. And wasn't Tycho Brahe, I believe, Danish?
He was in that area, as was his young pupil and later successor, Johannes Kepler, who spent much of his time also in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in the area you might call Germany today.
My question is, obviously your works were printed in England and Germany, which were both non-Catholic countries. And
not all of Germany. There were many German states. Some were Catholic, some were not.
That's right. Did you ever consider leaving Italy and moving to one of these countries? And do you think your patronage by the Medici family protected you from death during the Inquisition?
Well, let's see. I did not consider leaving Italy because up until 1633, there was no need for me to consider that. After 1633, I was under interdict and under arrest. I was in what you might call house arrest and unable to leave Italy. I could not even go back to Florence. And I would also say that as far as the idea that I might perhaps have been able to leave, my health was such that I was not able to leave. The Medici family, I think, did intervene. I think my age also, and the state of my health also, kept any serious thought of torture or execution as not a real possibility. Perhaps over this way.
This is a personal question, Mr. Galilei. You claim that the Inquisition accused you of two things, one of which was not being a good Catholic, and the other one was that you disobeyed the Holy Father.
Both of those charges were withdrawn and were not part of the final charge or sentence.
Okay, so how can you claim to be a good Catholic when you did not marry your wife, who furthermore brought you 3 children, maybe 3 children?
She didn't want to be married.
Oh, thank you.
I did provide dowries for both my daughters, but I didn't have to do that. Instead, I enabled them to, I gave contributions to the church when I entered orders. I helped my son Vincenzio become established, and my first grandson was born shortly after I was given my sentence by the Holy Office. And I have been a support to all of my children. But when I left Padua, Marina Gamba refused to go with me to Florence. She was content to stay in Padua, and I never returned to Padua.
Galileo, we have time for one more question.
All right, right over here then.
As you probably know, in our day and age, there are a lot of people who are very conflicted about the claims between creationism on the one hand and evolution on the other. I wonder if you could comment on the conflict from the perspective of your own experiences with faith and science.
These are strange words to me. If you are suggesting that that this is a conflict between science and religion, perhaps we could discuss that in just a moment in perhaps another vein. But I would suggest that I think the church is too quick to feel endangered by issues of science, when in fact, as Augustine has pointed out, issues of devotion and faith are what we should draw from the Holy Word, and the Holy Word, as inspired by the Holy Ghost, is sufficient to our religious needs. And we need not feel any harm by things given by that great gift of God, reason to us, to help us better understand this world, as so long as that does not interfere with our devotions and our pursuit of the salvation of our soul. Well, perhaps, as you perhaps know, I'm not Galileo. I'm Fred Krebs, and I could take just a few questions as the person behind Galileo. Let me...
Literature about Galileo when you went to study him? In other words, his contemporaries that wrote about him as a person, or were you deriving most of your material from his own works or written material?
Well, you have quite a letters correspondence. You also have a biography that was published very shortly after his death in 1642 by one of his pupils. So you do have that type of information. You also have the proceedings of the Holy Office, but those were sealed. They're available now, but they were sealed. And of course, as I think many of you know, it was about 3 years ago, that Pope John Paul II declared that the Catholic Church was mistaken in what they had said about Galileo, and that Galileo's ideas were now accepted by the Church. So, 350 years, more or less. But as far as sources, I used letters of his contemporaries about him, as well as relying on his own formal writings and letters.
How do you know, how did Galileo make the telescope?
Well, that was the thing that I think interested me the most when I started researching this. In fact, I ended up getting a book on how to make your own telescope, because, as you probably gather, my background is not science and mathematics as far as what I teach, but astronomy's been a hobby for only about 40 years. What he did is he made a tube out of lead, and then he ground his own lenses. But the great difference that Galileo did is by using both a convex and a concave lens, one that was thinner in the middle and one that was thicker in the middle, all right? And arranging a proper proportion between those, where the larger lens would be put at one end and the smaller lens about 2/3 of the way back toward the eyepiece. He was able to develop a telescope that enabled him to see about 20 times larger the objects, and about 100 times further in terms of the distance than the one that had been developed up in the Netherlands. He also did some work at trying to apply this to examining insects as well. We could do one more question, perhaps. I see the hook coming out.
What did you think when you first saw the sunspot?
I'm not Galileo anymore. What did he think when he first saw the sunspots? Galileo basically thought that they were on the surface of the sun, and he could do that by the way he detected a motion in relationship between, and shadows he actually detected, a relationship between the sunspots and the surface of the sun. And see, this was a great issue. If they were not part of the sun, then they did not threaten Aristotle's theory about the celestial sphere not changing. But if they were part of the sun, then that threw the whole idea that the celestial planets, those beyond bodies, beyond the moon, could change. That threatened Aristotle's whole theory of these perfect concentric spheres with the Earth at the center. And so this is just one more kind of proof that called into question the Ptolemaic system developed on the teachings of Aristotle. Well, it's been a real pleasure for me to be up here. I've got a panel at 1:30. Hope to see many of you then.